Um, oui, Annie. Bonjour, hi. Je m'appelle Lila Cachou
Hello, my name is Leila Kashou,
et je suis la coordinatrice
and I'm the
pour
research
l'Institution de
coordinator
Doge,
for
l'environnement
Tahingonzoge,
ou la recherche sur
Quebec Network Environment for Indigenous Health
et
Research.
je vais juste m'arrêter là une seconde pour dire
So I'll
que cette
stop just a
traduction
second to
est
say
possible.
also that we have
Donc,
the simultaneous
vous pouvez
interpretation.
appuyer sur le en bas de l'écran sur
So
Interpretation
if
et
you
choisir
want, you can click on the little globe at the bottom and you
So just at the
choose
bottom of
the
the
language
screen,
of
it says
your choice
simultaneous interpretation,
to listen
and there's
to.
that little kind of globe, and you can click on it to have English or French. Donc, nous aimerions commencer ce webinaire pour remercier.
So we would like to begin this webinar by thanking all of our panelists who have agreed to share with us and with you the work that they're doing, the work that they're doing as researchers, teachers in the academic institutions. And we would also like to thank all of you who are here as participants and who share our interest in informing the discussion about promising practices that promote institutional transformation in education, and therefore that facilitate success and persistence for Indigenous students throughout their educational journey. I am Jojoge, presently an unceded territory, also historically frequented by the Anishinaabe Nation, and we invite you to share in the chat all the territories that were shaped by the Indigenous people.
On t'entend pas, Audrey.
Bien sûr. Donc, merci beaucoup, Leila, pour cette introduction. Donc,
Thank you, Leila, for this introduction. My name is Audrey Monadeshan. So I'm a part of the Quebec Network Environment for Indigenous Health Research, and this is the fourth webinar discussion over a cup of tea, Indigenous researchers and professors. So today, the webinar will be on professors and scholars working in the universities, and they are crucial. They have unique journeys. However, they are historically underrepresented in the university environment. They've been contributing in a very important way to progress in their respective fields and to offer diversified experience and expertise fields. And they're also models for the future students. As there's little research investigating the realities of being an Indigenous professor, this webinar will highlight the diverse realities, their work, challenges, and successes. So today, we have 4 professors and researchers with us who have been working in the universities of Quebec. So we have with us Trina Delormier, Poisson-Thieu Delormier.
Nous avons aussi Stéphane Dandonneau.
We have Stéphane Dandonneau, who's also part of the Memorial University Newfoundland. We have Janine Elizabeth Metwick, who's associate professor.
Et finalement, nous avons Suzy Basile, qui est professeure à l'École d'études autochtones à l'UQAT. Donc, je vais enlever
We
le...
also have Suzy Basile, professor, School of Native Studies, Université du Québec, Abitibi-Témiscamingue. And I will also add that we'll begin with a discussion, but we'll keep some time afterwards for questions. And at the end, we'll also share with you in the chat, we'll share a link for feedback so that you can give your feedback, ask your questions about the webinar, because that's very helpful for us for the future webinars.
Merci beaucoup pour ce petit commentaire. Lila?
J'allais juste
Thank
dire,
you. Thank you, Lila. And I also wanted to add that the chocolate has just arrived. So Trina just got your chocolate.
Peut-être tu vas expliquer, Audrey.
Oui, donc dans le fond, c'est un peu un
Well,
webinaire différent de ce qu'on a fait.
It's a different webinar, different from the ones we organized before. Usually we have panelists who come and present the work that they're doing, but today it's a little bit different. It's more a discussion around the kitchen table, so it's a little bit more informal. And we know that the panelists who are here with us are very busy in their work, so we wanted to organize something that is a little bit more relaxed to hear of what they're doing, their successes, their challenges. So the first question we would like to ask our panelists is, well, can you talk about what informed your relationship with research and academia?
And Trina, I'm going to put you on the spot because you are our PI. So can you talk about what informed your relationship, or what is your story with research and teaching at a university level?
Okay, Audrey, were you asking me? I'm sorry, I got a little bit messed up with the interpretation. I lost my confidence to listen to the
Of course, don't worry about it. So what is your story, your life story about research and teaching as a professor at the academia? What informed your experience? Like, what made you want to be a researcher and a professor at the same time? Well, or separately.
You don't have a choice in university, usually as a faculty member, to do research. You have to do research, teaching, and service are the three kind of pillars. But what brought me to this, like, just very briefly, because I think everyone's got an interesting story to tell. I was fortunate to have two parallel experiences. So my background is in nutrition. I'm a dietitian by training. And actually, since I'm saying this, it's probably appropriate if I introduce myself formally. So, según se wakwego wasundio yujats, wakatayuni ni wagitarodo, kahnawagi ni de wagano, kanyokahaga. So I'm Mohawk. I'm people of the Flint. I'm from Kahnawake, and I'm of the Wolf Clan. And as I started to mention, I studied nutrition, and I'm a dietitian by training and still am licensed in Quebec. And I did research in nutrition for my master's degree when I didn't find any job in dietetics, despite what, the call that there was a lot of need for dietitians and nutritionists in our community. But fortunately, I had been working as an undergraduate with Dr. Harriet Kuhnlein, who started the Center for Indigenous Peoples Nutrition and Environment, a research center dedicated to promoting and protecting and showing the benefits of Indigenous peoples' food systems, and also using a model because the center was directed by an Indigenous advisory board. So they were back in 1994 when the center began already listening to Indigenous communities about how they wanted research done. And around the same time, the Kahnawake Schools Diabetes Prevention Project was launched after 10 years of basically responding to the community saying, we want to prevent these high rates of diabetes in Kahnawake. So in 1994, the project started, and I was invited because of my background in nutrition and research to be a part of that project. And I'll conclude by saying it was my experiences with KSDPP, or that project in Kahnawake, that provided me with multiple opportunities to see how a community can mobilize to do research on an issue that held significance for them, and then to continue to build on successful research to then build a research center that established practices for doing respectful research that valued Indigenous knowledge. And through that experience, you know, I was a research assistant, I was a student, I did my doctoral research with KSDPP, and those experiences together provided me the training, the experiences that placed me in a position to feel like I wanted to do independent research, and that I could do that in an institutional setting. Thank you.
Thank you, Trina.
I don't know if you wanted to.
I'm letting you.
Okay. I'll jump in now. I figured it's, my background is a bit similar to Trina's in some respects. And then eventually it took a different turn actually, but similar, I would say that my undergrad experience started out in an interest in health sciences. And so I started out actually even before that doing a health science diploma at CEGEP. I then moved into studying chemistry of all things at a university, at Ottawa University. It was my first time away from my home community. It was actually rather a big shock to me, a cultural shock. This was in the early 90s. And so I actually had quite a disruptive experience early on. But fortunately, even though I found I was like being asked to withdraw actually from my first year of university, I ended up applying to McGill that same year. And based on my CEGEP grades, I was able to get into McGill. And so I started out in pretty much the same area as Trina. I was doing my undergraduate degree, Bachelor of Science in Nutritional Sciences. I chose at that time not to go into dietetics because I was mostly interested in just health in general. And so nutrition was kind of like a nice compromise for me to study human nutrition and, you know, just get the basics. From then, it was similar. After I graduated, I never expected to do research or to go on. I had no plans for doing higher education after that. But I found myself in a similar situation. Job prospects, were just random. And so I decided to go back to school to do a second bachelor degree, another Bachelor of Science, where I studied psychology, again at McGill University. And so I had that experience of, okay, I have one degree, you know, it wasn't the greatest, necessarily the greatest experience because there were some issues of tokenism and even at those early years. But moving into psychology, I found it was a nice change, still somewhat health related. I looked at the scientific, scientific aspects or background behind the brain and behavior and things like that. So I really enjoyed that experience. And it was at the downtown campus of McGill. But again, it was just circumstances where I ended up getting a job after that working at Health Canada for the Quebec region, replacing somebody who was on leave. And that turned into a longer, maybe a 1.5 year experience. And from there, it was actually a former professor who brought me back and said, maybe you would consider applying for a master's degree back at the McDonald campus in nutrition. And I thought about it, and this person, I guess, somehow convinced me that, it would be beneficial to go back and do a master's and so on. And so that's the route I took into coming back into doing research and being further involved in academia. But I have to say it was just circumstances. I never actually had like a long-term vision for working in academia, but that was the route that I took. Fast forward a bit, I did my master's looking at diabetes in the Cree community in Northern Quebec. So that kind of got me back into working with community, and I really enjoyed that experience, doing qualitative work on the experience that people had living with diabetes. And then again, things changed. I ended up going back into doing a different field altogether. So now where I work now is actually where I did my PhD in educational studies. And I look at languages, Indigenous languages and Indigenous education. And so again, maybe Trina, you reminded me too of introducing ourselves. You know, we sometimes forget to do that in these spaces. So I'll do it now. I'll introduce myself in my language. So I'm Indelewi Janine Metallic, Afle Wilistiguch, Migmagi, Wiki Listiguch Migmagi, Kespegwagi, Nege Lukwe Ladit Muliang McGill University. Noel Gleesdale. And so Sego Sewakwegu, Janine Metallic Yajats. I wanted to add that in because it's something that I think is important as an Indigenous person, but outside of my territory and in a different one. I want to say that, introduce myself in the language of the local, in the local language, so that, and I want to express that I'm part of my own coming back to Indigenous research and academia is really focusing on local languages and knowledges. And so that's my part of my goal now is also learning Ganyangea. And so that was just a short introduction. I'll go to the next speaker now.
Thank you, Janine. Que Suzy ou de Stéphane voudriez prendre la parole, partager?
Je vais y aller. I will speak French, so if you want to switch.
I'm going to speak French. So my process looks like Janine's process. Me neither. Over a long-term period, I didn't think I would be a professor or I would work in a university. However, I'm a Makaza child, one of those children that grew up with parents who have studied at the Manitou College in the north of Montreal in 1970s. I was really young, but I have clear recalls of that period, and throughout the years and over the past few years, I find myself in the region of La Tuque and then in Quebec City for college and university, and I have observed in that period in my communities where I saw people who would take picture of elders who would practice traditional activities like my own kokum, my own grandmother, and people would come and arrive and wouldn't even say hello and would take pictures. I observed throughout also the studies I've led. I fell on books that talked about my people. I didn't recognize the people those books were talking about, and I also saw pictures and showed them to my members of my family, and they didn't were not conscious that it had been pictured in those books. So that really questioned me. How do researchers dare to do that? And after I studied in anthropology at Laval University, I started with a certificate and afterwards a license and then a master's. And I put an emphasis throughout that process on the tourism industry that have some impacts in many First Nations communities and also somewhere else like Labrador and Newfoundland, and how it contributed to development really and the image and how that specific nation decided what is good to be shown to a tourist and what was marketable. Of course, there are some choices in that process. So those are kind of questions that really interested me. Afterwards, I had the opportunity to work for many organizations, Indigenous organizations, First Nations, Assembly First Nations, also the Canadian Museum of Civilization, who is now the Canadian History Museum. I was assistant of in the research in that office, and I had the opportunity to research in the museum collections, to choose some pieces, artifacts, to go through card decks and identify information for the artifacts that we selected with the objective to show the diversity of First Nations in Canada. So those were always elements that really interested me throughout the years. Afterwards, I decided to go back to university to lead a PhD focused on environmental sciences. I was very interested with the voice of women that we hear less, with issues linked to territories compared to men. So, of course, women had a key experience of the territory, and very rarely would we ask women about their knowledge about the territory. So I really focused on this. Eventually, I was offered a position at the university, and strangely, nowadays I work mainly on issues linked to health. It's not health issues as such or health topics, but because I'm not specialized in that, I'm more an anthropologist. But our vision is necessarily holistic as a Tikmek vision, and I create linkages between I'm interested on the gaps faced by women in the health system and in other domains also, all the issues linked to maternity, pregnancies, and all the work and involvement of women in those domains. That's where I'm at right now. Those are topics that didn't really draw enough attention in the past decades. And researchers like Trina and Janine, and maybe a little bit myself, we can train other people that will work in the future, and eventually will be many more Indigenous researchers in Quebec. I believe that we're less than 10 researchers from Indigenous nations in the academia. So we have a place to occupy in that domain. Thank you. I believe that I have the floor. Thank you. Thank you, Susie. Hello, my name is Stéphane Dandonné. I'm from Saint-Boniface, Winnipeg. I'm a Franco-Métis. We have somehow lost our language, but really as Métis, we never really had a language. Michif is maybe the main language closer to my reality. I understand Miigwech because I'm most of the words are in French actually, but there are other Métis languages, of course. What we highlight in the south of Manitoba, we're Métis. It's a way of saying that that we come from a specific region. Not too many Métis says Métis and Saint Boniface in French. So I grew up in Saint Boniface in a minority context. I studied school and also secondary, and eventually went to University of Manitoba to do my honors. I'll start by my career process there, because I like to respond to Audrey's question. What comes to my mind, it's really hard. It's very complicated. There are so many tensions.
It's complicated and it'll never be simple. Ce qui est tout à fait correct. Je veux dire, c'est un peu la beauté de vivre entre.
It's fantastic. It's a reality of living in between two worlds, of so many things in our spirit and head at the same time, and to bring forward our perspective and how we share experience of life. I would like to share with you an experience. What I've made in the past, it's not really important. What I want to share with you is I started my a PhD in psychology. It was not clinical. It was really focused on the human instead of being very clinic on neurons and so on. So I started my PhD, and because I was French outside of Quebec, there's a foundation that is very generous, which is Ricard Foundation, is a family from Sudbury who has many funding and gives a lot of funding to francophones outside of Quebec who develop studies just about everywhere in the world. Thanks to being a minority person and was doing that PhD, I obtained that grant and really helped me to do what I wanted to achieve and develop. My wife at that point was studying in McGill. She's also Indigenous, and she was interested on Indigenous law. She said, I want to go to New Zealand and work with the Maori. Oh, great. So I'll go get some funding from Ricard Foundation and I'll invent myself a research in order to follow you in New Zealand. That's what we did. I was always, when I applied to psychology, it was most focused on cultural psychology, but my supervisor didn't know anything about that. So we talk about mainstream self-stress and so on. What would that specific project? Maybe I wanted to put a foot in that contest, so I prepared a beautiful project with tribal nation, who really worked on the Maori treaty. They were very powerful. That really confronted the government. Worked on a large treaty that brought about many other smaller treaties afterwards. So that's a society that's very important, and one of the things that Maori went through and lived is the Treaty of Waidini. When the colonists arrived, there's a Maori tribe that said we'll get organized, or we are signatories of the treaty, or if you're not signatories. So I was wondering how social perspectives before signing the treaty and after signing the treaty. So I focus my interest on how they perceive that treaty. They envisioned that the signature in the end of 19th century. So I built up my fantastic project in my backpack.
Signing of the treaty, blah, blah, blah. Puis le chef, à ce point-là, de la tribu avec qui on travaillait.
So the chief of that tribe, Wakanya Kagwe, and he said, et ils ont dit,
là, j'étais comme tabarouette. Puis je me suis senti vraiment comme.
So I really felt, wow, that was like a book of emotion. That was something that at that day that was a very impregnant experience, but really called on me on different levels. I was so naive at that point. I made that effort to understand what had happened. And then I was confronted to the lack of preparation I had received because, wanted or not, I was in a context where the ethics and discussions with community partners, it really so. So that was very important experience. In one shot, in 5 minutes, I learned so much of what not to do and what to do. It was really both sides at once. And it really made a trace into myself. So after having talked to the chief, Havino,
c'est là où c'est vraiment l'apprentissage que j'ai découvert.
That's where I learned the learnings. It was interdisciplinary research, whatever you call it. That's where the learning, I remade that learning that I didn't have accumulated in the past. So that's really an experience that it was very key in my process. And since then, I always had that ambivalent relation between research and what's happening concretely in the communities. When I end the PhD, it was a psychology mainstream. Afterwards, usually you go to a post PhD in social recognition or whatever, and you want to you want to work with people that you've read and books. But I said, fuck the system. So I asked myself, so what my heart tells me, and my heart wanted to learn and follow up on what I had learned in 5 minutes with that chief. So I finally found in Cultural Mental Health Institute in Montgomery and his team, where there's a transcultural approach. Around the table, it's not only psychologists, but many people from different contexts, and they really talk about questions from a holistic point of view, a global point of view. A PhD in quantitative psychology with stats just about everywhere, and then I went to a postdoc in a qualitative in a different context. People asking me, what are you going to do? You won't find a job with this. But really, my process was to follow up on the experience I had lived with the Maori in New Zealand. So throughout this process, I said, "Oh, I'm a Métis. Oh, who am I?" I'm always plunged in two worlds and two languages and two universes. So I also have interest still in the mainstream context. I'm interested in social distress and so on, but I'm also interested in community processes, how we can impregnate ourselves and cultural diversity, and how it has an impact on our thoughts. And so after my postdoc, I don't have to choose between mainstream and being a community researcher. I can be someone that can do both of them simultaneously. So in order to respond to Audrey's question, somehow I've learned from a context, and that has an incidence on another context, and so on. There's a back and forth process, and the ball keeps rolling. And I try to keep that focus consciously, and I'm trying to transfer knowledge to my students. So what I'm doing is something very different than what we read in the books. All the questions I'm posing, I'm identifying, I'm asking what your grandmother would think. That's my approach. That's my deep inside feeling. It's not an approach that I read in an anthropology book or sociological books. It's my approach. I try to identify the parts that are different from my own past and experiences, and to bring students to go in their own past and experiences, because they are valuable in their processes of research. So it's very complicated, but that's life. That's how it goes. Thank you so much for this answer. That is very colorful answer, really. And since we talked about research, and we're a research network.
So I'd like to know, all of you have done research for a long time, donc vous avez tous fait de la recherche depuis longtemps.
You've made research for a long time. How have you seen research evolve?
Réconciliation a changé le contexte de recherche.
Does reconciliation has changed the context of research? What are the main challenges, but also the highlights and success stories that you identified throughout this process? So I'll give you a few minutes to think about this. And can also drop the question that you formulated in the chat if you want. Maybe I can jump in. I don't know if you wanted to follow the same order of panelists. No, as you wish. Okay. So linked to reconciliation. I'm ambivalent about this. I've discussed this with friends. I'm not against it, of course, but to have a reconciliation, you have to conciliate something at the starting point, and I haven't found yet convincing examples of this. So we are in the context of more appropriation, a loss of territories, a loss of self-determination, to finally land at reconciliation that are so important for some decision bodies. But we need to admit, not only in the words, but also in action, that there's a heavy past on which we don't have to come back every day, but that needs to be recognized, needs to be evoked and talked about beyond words. Words are not sufficient. I prefer a daily action instead of reconciliation wordings. I'll give you a very simple example that really makes me smile when I think about it.
De Cashton et d'un autre band
Well, it's the
autochtone.
music of Cashton and another Indigenous band that plays, and it's a non-Indigenous school in a Quebec milieu, and this does me good. It kind of reconciliates me with that reality, with our respective lives. I'm sure that it doesn't fix everything, but I prefer that to discourses of politicians promising all kind of things. So the wave of reconciliation in which our institutions embarked is part of a long process. I receive it, I welcome it, and participate in that when I can. But as I said, I prefer the concrete actions, the openness to new courses or new positions as well for Indigenous teachers or professors, the space given to Indigenous languages that should be greater. And even though we're talking about the celebration of Indigenous languages, after 10 years, we hear too little about that and too few actions. So I don't want to sound pessimistic. I'm just realistic. I keep the door open to all kinds of initiatives, but we still have to make our way in all that, because nobody will open the door for us. That's clear. So I don't want to end on a negative note, but I don't wake up in the morning saying today I will reconciliate with someone or something. I probably am busy doing other things. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I just wanted to add too, I think I echo a lot of what Susie just said in terms of, you know, the whole process of, or the idea of reconciliation. It is a long process, as she just mentioned. And also the idea that we're really looking, as Indigenous peoples, I think we're looking really for those concrete actions, like she just said. For me, I find similarly, because I work at McGill, there's been this like abundance suddenly of, you know, as was said, new courses, but along with that, new grants, along with that comes new committees. And often that work falls on, you know, the few Indigenous people who are within the university. And so I think there's definitely some good, but definitely challenges, as was just mentioned. I question a lot about, I sort of like, I'm suspicious at times, and or maybe I have a bit of skepticism. Again, not trying to be negative, but I think realist, as Susie said, the reality that we face is that there's an abundance of people now who want to work with Indigenous communities, even more so than in the past. But I also look back to questioning sometimes the intent behind those opportunities, they call them. You know, sometimes it's like, oh, we have an opportunity to partner with you, or there's this opportunity for you to be a collaborator, or you know, a co-applicant on a grant or something like that. I always question the intent or the motivation behind some of those initiatives. And so that's one thing. So I just, kind of park that aside too. The other thing is that I think sometimes we move too fast or move too quickly to talking about reconciliation, where we don't really have like a foundation upon which to build. So basic information about Indigenous peoples is not at the forefront. Basic information about the local territory or the regional territory and the peoples within those areas is often something that I quickly found out in teaching students in education, is that it's not a part of their curriculum. So they come into university not knowing about, First Peoples in Quebec or in the local area. And so they lack that experience, and yet here we are trying to jump to reconciliation. But the reality is, it's like the whole idea of reconciliation came from a process of truth and reconciliation. And so I always go back to the truth. And so in teaching students and my colleagues, I am mindful of keeping at the forefront the reality and the truth that we face as Indigenous peoples, whether it's in the university or outside of the university. I think that's something that needs to be highlighted and not forgotten in this whole process. I'll leave it there for now. I just want to add to what Susie mentioned earlier.
Thank you, Janine. So Trina or Stéphane, est-ce que vous voulez, do you want to?
I can follow up. Yeah, I agree with what's been said. There's sort of a skepticism about, it's great that there's this process happening on a national level. There's imperatives for different offices to start to develop strategies, policies, and action plans. So they need to do something. But as it, starts to then, whether it be from bottom up, things are changing, or from the top down, things are changing. I find as an Indigenous researcher, similarly to what Janine was saying, we get asked to, because people, whether in the institution, whether it's a senior administration, they want to do it right, for people, for not everyone, but like there are people who want to do it correctly. And then, so they're asking the Indigenous people how to do it correctly, or for our guidance. And, that adds up to a lot of meetings and new committees and new initiatives. And then, it's not a smooth road. It's a very complex, journey to undo this very violent, oppressive history, so the truth of that is you confront it when you deal with these things, whether it's directly or indirectly. It's a very challenging thing to do on a daily basis when you wake up and figure out how you're doing your day. I remember being at a meeting where Murray Sinclair, who was the commissioner for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that finalized the report. It was a meeting of the Tri-Council research funders, and looking at how can they form their policy so that they're addressing reconciliation in research institutions. And I remember what he said at the end of the meeting to Indigenous researchers. He said, this is not on you to lead this, or definitely there's participation. And he said, your research needs to inform what reconciliation can be, what it should be, providing the evidence for how it can be done. And I thought that was very, very empowering words, to sort of be let go from feeling like, you have this huge responsibility. Although I didn't feel like I was responsible for it. When you're in an institution that does have those responsibilities, it does come, you get requested to do certain things. I think a lot about this with our network, right? The network is focused on communities. How can we support communities to be able to do research in the way that meets their needs, but also their aspirations for the future health of their our communities. And so, you know, there's our objectives we have at the NEIHR, but I am thinking a lot, especially because of the many calls for, you know, research grant opportunities, the calls for funding, requests for applications, all those processes now have an EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion. I don't know, I'll call it a component, but those things need to be explicitly addressed. Like, how are you ensuring your research is not going to, or is going to address practices that have created inequities in the past or currently. But there's also the Indigenous involvement, inclusion because of reconciliation. We can no longer, you know, exclude Indigenous people. We need to be able to address that in our research. And all of that means that, okay, they're looking to, what did you say, Susie, the 10 researchers in the institutions, well, there's more, in other institutions, other people and Indigenous organizations are being solicited for their participation. But it's still a small number of people and organizations who have the experience and the capacity who are being asked for that. And it's impossible to think that, you know, individually we can be co-PIs on so many grants. That's not the way to do it. And so what I've been thinking about with the NEIHR team and just with other folks here at McGill is the idea that, you know, relationships are the foundation for doing respectful research, good relationships, strong relationships. And institutions, universities need to invest in enhancing the capacity of researchers in the institution to be able to appreciate what that involves and how it impacts careers and what it means for doing your research project. You don't put a person on who's Indigenous and it's the box is check mark. There's a lot going on there. And so I think a lot about how can that happen, because the network, the idea for the network came because the project I was telling you about in Kahnawake, the school-based diabetes prevention project, you know, was a model for how to do that. I was really fortunate to actually have that as my initial training space, my initial training lab within my home community. Imagine being able to be trained in a good way of doing research and also having that experience within my institution. So I was feeling like the practices of how do you conduct respectful research and build trusting relationships was part of all of my training. It's why I went into public health after nutrition and health promotion, because it really valued addressing inequities and injustice. But it's about, you know, practices for doing this research. Practices reinforce systems. You know, systems are basically enduring sets of these practices. And so I'm thinking, like, how do we change systems in an institution so that practices are change and are, you know, reflected in better ways of doing research? And, you know, I'm working to figure out how we can create spaces in universities that enhance capacities of university-based researchers to do this right. And it's the imperative of the university to do that. Similarly to how, you know, they invest in big equipment to do state-of-the-art research, we need to invest in capacity so that communities are not harmed by just being solicited for research. So in the context of reconciliation, I've seen, you know, the opportunities and the need, the imperative to address Indigenous peoples, populations, not to redress what has been done in the past. And, you know, I'm also feeling the pull and the demand of it. And there's one final thing I'll just end on. In all of this, it's fair, you know, time, right? You didn't have to, things are very timely and things are moving very quickly. And you if you're fortunate and have been tenured, you know, otherwise you need to demonstrate that you're publishing. And those demands on how you get evaluated in the university are incredibly stressful. And so mentors will have told me, I need to ask myself for everything I'm doing in research, what do I get out of it? What do I get out of it that's going to count in the university? And that totally confronts how I think about research, because I've trained in research. How do we do this to respect the community and bring benefit to the community? So you have these two kinds of expectations on being, if you're working in a community, Indigenous communities, to you know, meet this meritocracy of what do I get out of this in terms of money for a grad student, a publication, so I can demonstrate that I'm being productive, versus like doing research that's ethical because we need to right these wrongs of the past. So we do carry some of the expectations of reconciliation in these spaces. But I do think there's a really timely opportunity to say this needs to happen. And how are you going to make this happen? You know, because people are in spaces where they can actually do something at those higher levels and just say, this is what we need. We need this to do it. And I'm learning how to have that voice because I realize it's going to be part of my survival in the institution. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Trina. Vas-y, Stéphane.
So, you know, it's interesting because I'm sort of the generation that probably benefits the most of all of the pains that my ancestors have lived through. Because, for example, this reconciliation, quick story, I was a professor, full professor at UQAM. So I got my last promotion in 2019. That same year, we were pregnant with our fourth baby. My wife is from Newfoundland, and we're like, we can't do this. You know, like we can't live in Montreal. Sorry, Quebec is fantastic, but sorry, we just can't. We can't raise our children here. And so it's either we go back to Winnipeg or we come back to Newfoundland. And we decided quite quickly that we would come to Newfoundland. So I basically left my full professorship at UQAM and moved to Newfoundland. COVID happened, great. I've got another year to kind of figure out. But for all intents and purposes, I left UQAM and a pension. You understand, right? You know, like the security and the cushy, and you can just sit on your bum and not do much for whatever, or you can die to whatever. So I left that because I had no job here. Memorial University, which is about 10 years behind, sort of initiatives and so on like that, they announced Indigenous cluster hire. Interesting, right? So they have 5 positions at the university, and obviously you have to be Indigenous to apply, so on and so forth. So obviously I'm like, this is, golden tickets, perfect. I apply. A year and a half later, 1 year and a half later, they come back to me and said, do you still want that job? Now, there's a few things, right? There's a few things going on here. The initiatives was fantastic, on an outwardly kind of like, oh wow, like university's progressing, they're laying out but the process was a shit show. The hire was a true shit show, and why do I have to live through that? It's kind of so I'm very ambivalent with these kind of like these processes and these things where you're like, in theory, the headline sounds great, but the person living through this is kind of it's a catch-22 of sorts. All that to say that I wasn't even hired through the Indigenous process, the Indigenous cluster. So they chose 5 other people to be put, and it was a political decision, right? It was a political decision because the provost had to decide, blah, blah, blah. But luckily, because of that, the psychology department met me and they said, we still want this person, not because they're Indigenous, but because there's they're a legitimate researcher and he would be an addition to the department. So it's kind of like weird because you live through these experiences of like, this should be a positive experience, but it's kind of a positive experience, but there's also kind of like, it kind of chips a little bit at your shoulder of sorts. So I find that, we have to live through this constantly, and we'll probably continue living through this. All that to say that in the end, I'm very grateful of everything that's happened. I'm very, very grateful. things happen for whatever, out of luck, out of, gratefulness, out of, the stars aligning, out of, my ancestors being out there, looking out for me, regardless of whatever happened, I'm very grateful. And I find that, what I'm struggling with is, fighting against what I call Indigenous washing. You know how there's like greenwashing and there's like, organics washing. So you put a green label on any product and all of a sudden it's better. Why? Because it's sustainable, ecological, or whatever. It's like, oats that are like gluten-free naturally. Obviously you put gluten-free on the oats bag and you can charge $4 instead of $2. Like, why? It was always like that. So this greenwashing, this food washing, whatever. I think that we're in the era of like Indigenous washing, where you put Indigenous on it, and obviously you kind of check that mark. And I find that we're in a situation where we kind of have to. We're the guardians of that, right? I mean, up to like, we've been put in a situation where we are the natural guardians of what is legit, what is less legit, what is the true intent. Like Janine was saying, like what is the true intent of these people? And what's their motivation? What's their motive? And then we're stuck kind of having to, it's been added to our workload, right? And that's just a reality. And I think that's all, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing. I'm not saying this is necessarily a good thing. I'm just saying that it adds to the complexity of what's going on forward. But, I consciously try to kind of, try to figure out where is there Indigenous washing and where is there's not Indigenous washing, which basically comes down to like what Janine was saying about, what is a true motivation? What is the authentic motivation of what this person wants and is striving for? So I find that that's one thing. I also find that, things like, I don't know if I should put the land acknowledgement in my email signature, because a lot of my settler colleagues do it. So I'm like, well, obviously acknowledge the land on which, this is not my land. I'm a guest in this land, but do I have to tell every other person about it? It's like, when I give money to someone, do I have to tell everyone that I'm giving money? So I'm conflicted, because obviously I fundamentally believe in, like this has to be shared. This has to be a social norm. But then like, when does it become sort of like, well, you have to do it because that's what everyone does it. What do you do it? And, so it's kind of like a brain fuck in me, for me. Sorry for swearing. I'm sorry. But it's like, it's all these conflict and all these kind of things in my head. And I'm like, should I do it? Should I not do it? Like, and the reason I don't do it is because fundamentally in my heart, I know that I acknowledge the land on which I am. And when I speak to people, when I don't have to tell them, but I appreciate and I respect that. And that for me is important enough for me. Now, I think these are all things that we have to kind of negotiate and navigate. And it's what's, it's kind of part of, this is kind of like this Indigenous washing of sorts. I'll shut up. Sorry.
Merci beaucoup, Stéphane. Thank you, Stéphane, for this. My last question would be, what do you want to say to Indigenous students who would like to pursue a career in research? Qu'est-ce que vous diriez aux étudiants qui aimeraient poursuivre une carrière en recherche, les étudiants autochtones?
So Indigenous students, what you say?
I mean, anytime someone says, I'm interested, yes, come right now. Let's sit. Like, I don't care where or how your interest, let's sit, we got to talk about it. Because as soon as someone indicates an interest, we have to absolutely cater to that interest. Il faut absolument concentrer nos énergies sur, parce que
we have to concentrate our energies on the interest of the student. As soon as the student says, I'm interested, it's a fantastic step, a huge step. When they say and they share and speak out about their interests, it's very important. We need to table on this.
We have to claim more resources from the university to help us do these types of things. So we have to figure out like, what are the core values that we want? And I think that, helping students and getting money for students and giving space for students, creating space for students, I think that's, in my mind, one thing that we can ask, we should demand from a university. I need this so that you can say that your Indigenous kind of EDI initiative is going, type of deal. And I think that as soon as our students are there, just to listen to them and to offer them any kind of support, whatever that is. Because that definitely is the next generation and next generations. And like, was mentioned already, that le plus de représentativité qu'on a à toutes
the
les
more representativity at all levels of universities and all classes, the more diversity we have, we're better off. That's first thing. I stop and I really sit down and I listen to the student. It takes time, of course. Fortunately, at the university, I've already had my promotion. I don't have to spend my time because I have time, and it's my time I need to dedicate to that students.
I'd be always like this mental calculation of like, okay, well, should I be spending so much time with the student, helping him or her, just because I'm dedicated? Like, I'm wasting my time because I should be doing this, this, and that. And that, unfortunately, is a reality. But is there a way out? I don't know. I don't know. But anyways, luckily, I'm at the point where I can do whatever I want, quote unquote. I'm not too worried about the mental calculation. That's what I mean. I'm not too worried about devoting so much time to this because this person has to agree to this, and I have to be seen as productive, blah 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 blah. So maybe we should all push each other up. Automatically full professors, just start doing real work. I don't care what you've done before. Let's get the next generation in. I think that's what we do. I vote for that.
Si je peux enchaîner avec ce que Stéphane
If
vient de
I
dire.
can jump in and team that with Stéphane's point of view. Yes, like Stéphane, I'm trying to take time to convince and stimulate Indigenous students that ask me what I do when I receive an invitation from CEGEP, from colleges. I go to recruit new studies, but to at least convince one of two what that is boiling in their heads in order for them to get involved, eventually establish a career. It's not the best word, of course, a career, but stimulate their interest in order to document our realities in our way. So CEGEP in college levels, it's a good moment to convince them and recruit them. Always am careful about not to scare them so they don't see the following 8 years as a big mountain to overcome. No, step by step. But yes, support the two. Not too many researchers in the Indigenous world. And also, finally, I was able at my institution to put in place a grant for women in specific Indigenous studies in order to stimulate the arrival of new researchers, women researchers in our institutions. But that's it. Thank you. Thank you so much, Susie, for attending and also sharing and attending this important conference. Thank you. Anyone else wants to jump in?
Do you want to go, or do you want me to go ahead?
Up to you. I have a lot to say about it, but maybe it's better if I let you go first.
Yeah, we're both at the same.
Yeah, exactly. And I just want to, just before Susie leaves, I just want to say, Wilani, thank you, because I really look up to, these are people who I look up to. I admire their work. And I'm one of those in those precarious positions because I'm not tenured. And so a lot of things that were brought up earlier are things that, ça mijote aussi, like it's in my mind, it's percolating. And but I'll have more to say about the supervising graduate students in a second. I'll let Trina go now.
So what I would say to Indigenous students, and what I do say or do, is, and I'll reiterate, respond immediately and spend time, to develop a good supportive relationship with the students. Because if I speak from my experience, when I first reached out to Harriet Kuhnlein, who was the director of the School of Human Nutrition, where I was an undergrad, and then was my supervisor for my master's, she responded immediately and pulled me in and got me like on for the summer on a research project. So an opportunity right away. But at the same time, you know, I also, the thought resonated with me about, but don't push too far or like push too fast, because it can also be intimidating. Because I remember at one point feeling like, you know, I was being, and, you know, probably it's my personal thing, felt like it was a lot of pressure, but it was to consider fast tracking into a PhD. And really, like, I had gone straight through school without a break. And the idea of becoming a PhD, and I just saw like immediately I would be like one of the researchers who only left like at 6:30 their office. I was like, that ain't for me. I'm out of here after my master's. But, you know, I did have that experience in my own community with research. So I felt like I had a number of opportunities. So I always keep that in mind, you know, to say like, this is a possibility, but it depends on what you want. Think about what you want. You know, I always give that back to the student, like, I'm just giving you options and let's talk about what it is that you want to do. But also finding those opportunities, you know, if there's funding needed, like try to find it and work on those sorts of things. There was something else I was going to say. Oh, with, it doesn't have to be a master's even, right? Like, I think within this network, we're also thinking about supporting students who might want to be doing a project related to a course or something that's, they're not thinking about it as research, but it's an opportunity for them to get a bit of research skills. And undergraduate summer research opportunities are a really good space to, you know, do a small project and get a little bit of experience. It's not intimidating. It can actually bring benefit to the student work. And then just to see like opportunities where they can work with their own community, or maybe stay in the city because they didn't plan on going back. Like, there's so many opportunities, like there's endless, we can come up with so many opportunities to make these experiences happen. And I think sometimes, if I remember coming at it, like from my experience, it seems that research is very intimidating, that you have to, I don't know, be something that I wasn't at the time. And then as I went through my research training, especially like at the doctoral level, I remember thinking like, you know, coming up with an original project must be so hard. But then when you start to realize what little we know about everything in the university world, it's like, oh, don't even worry about that. We'll come up with a topic. We're going to come up with something that's going to work. And just, I guess, providing that true, don't lie to the students, obviously make them feel like anything is possible, being realistic, but also saying that, you know, this is not like, it's not as intimidating as it can be. Like, and you can do something, especially at this time, you know, that is meaningful to yourself, maybe to your community, and for other relationships that are important for that student. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, Nyama, Trina, for sharing that. It's what I wanted to say earlier is that for me, even though I am, like I said, in this precarious position of pre-tenure, I have to say that working with Indigenous graduate students in particular has been the best part of my job. And I will say that until I get kicked out of the university. But it's, I have to say the highlight of my experience at McGill has been at this point in time, where I'm in a position now where I'm currently supervising 3 PhD students, PhD candidates. And one is, 2 are from Kahnawake, and so that's my part of my reason for learning the language as well, you know, to support and to encourage them in their work and to build that relationship with them, not only them, but their families and their communities. And I just have this love for the language and the knowledge that comes with it, because that's important. When we talk about Indigenous research methodologies, we're not talking about some generic one-size-fits-all methodology, but we're actually creating these methodologies from our own knowledge and our own positions, our own knowledges and positions. And just this morning, I was talking to one of my supervisees, And it was just so exciting to talk about Ongwe ways of doing things. And she was talking about Haudenosaunee scholars and what do they bring to the table in terms of research, and how does she become part of that community of scholars. And for me, it was just like, I wish I had had that experience, you know, as a graduate student. Those days are, you know, they're long gone now. But I feel like, if anything, I get to contribute and give back to the community in this way. Whether or not I have a career in academia long-term, or if I can sustain what I'm doing right now, I feel like I've already had that impact, whether it be on 1 or 2 or 3 students. I feel that, like I said, it's the best part of my job. And just to interact with students, and they say it so often, they just say it's such a different feeling to be able to work with another Indigenous scholar and not have to explain yourself, or to like go over like back to basics and talk about like, oh, what's residential school and what's the Indian Act and what's it like living on reserve. And, you know, we're so proud to say, like, at least in our situation, the ones I work with, we say we're so proud to be res raised, you know, like if you talk about res dogs, we know what you're talking about. It's kind of like, it's like knowing who we are and the community to which we belong is so important. The third student who I supervise, I mean, that's even more unique because we're from the same nation. We're not from the same community, but we speak the same language, albeit a slightly different dialect. You know, he's from Cape Breton. I'm from Gaspé-Gawagi or Gaspésie. So it's funny, but like we have interactions in the language which are so much richer, because we can speak, we literally speak the same language. We don't have to speak in English or French or whatever the situation is because of where we are. We just go back into who we are, not where we are and everything else, and just that communication makes it so much more meaningful. And I think that's what Trina said earlier about finding research that's meaningful. I think these students have already found that. They know what's meaningful for them. And I do all that I can to encourage that. I could go on about graduate students because I just really love that experience. I love it, love it, love it. But I just want to say that there's another part of my job right now, even though it hasn't, and I don't know how this will factor into my tenure portfolio or dossier or what have you, but just today there was an announcement that went out. I've recently taken on a new position within the university as an academic lead for Indigenous graduate student success. And I shared that with the team, well, I guess a few days ago, but that's the latest announcement. And so I'm glad that the university has recognized that I put in this extra emotional labor and you know, into the relationships, because I think that's the key for not just recruiting students. I don't even like saying that. It sounds like we're recruiting for the army or something, but like just bringing students into relationship with academia and with research. And I feel like I said, it's the best part of my job. I wouldn't trade it for anything. And so I'm hoping that in this, what is now a pilot project, I hope something will grow out of that to enhance the capacity for Indigenous scholars and Indigenous community members to engage in research and education that's meaningful and that prioritizes, you know, that puts at the center their priorities. And so I just want to make that statement, I guess, and a little bit of an announcement. But I want to thank all of you for, you know, inviting me to be part of this panel. I feel humbled at the same time because I know a lot of you are well ahead in your careers, but I just want to share that for today. And so, yeah, I'll stop for now.
Yeah, if I can, I raised my hand because I wanted to note that I don't have, like in Janin's program, there's a real interest, and she's got many Indigenous graduate students, which is great because actually it's fun to have those people from my community that I talk to and see how we might collaborate or we can be mutually supportive of our work, right? But in nutrition, because it's a degree that requires like a science background. You have to come out of CEGEP with a health science degree or the certificate. That's those STEM programs, right? So in order to get into nutrition, it's a lot of, we recognize that can be a challenge for Indigenous students. So I have actually one Métis student who's working with me, but we don't get very many Indigenous students into the program. So that's a challenge, even though most of my work is qualitative research and it's public health oriented and health promotion oriented. That's a continual challenge. Like, how do we get more people interested? I have had students interested, but it's they don't have the background. And there was something else I wanted to say and I forgot what it was. Oh, anyway, I'll pass the floor. I feel like I'm in the Congress now. I'll stop there.
Merci énormément pour partager ce que vous venez de partager à tous les trois. Thank you so much
Thank you so much for sharing. Pierre, did you have a question? Yes, actually, it's a comment. I assume that we were getting to the section where we could ask questions or make comments. So thank you so much. It was really interesting listening to you. And as a professor myself, one of the aspects that is important, because you spoke of the challenges, but there's also the academic freedom, which is important. We have a lot of barriers with administration, but in terms of what we can do in terms of research, there are many opportunities with the support that comes with it, the support to research in Indigenous health, because we're talking about that, but many other topics as well that revolve around Indigenous people. There are huge opportunities. And I suspect that you also talk about that to your students, because there are beautiful things. There are some constraints because you have to fit into a frame that you describe very well. And even for the non-Indigenous, I can tell you that it's not necessarily easier when you have to go through the system, especially if you're in a field like Indigenous health or natural products that are a little bit out of the mainstream. You have to fight to go ahead. But the opportunities, the possibilities are there. So getting into the system for many Indigenous people is a challenge, is quite a huge challenge, I understand. So, but it's just to say that there's much value nevertheless. And despite the fact that we invest a lot of hours, we have a certain freedom about how to organize our work at the university, which is not the case in other fields. So this is just a comment that I wanted to share with you. Thank you, Pierre. Thank you for your comment. In the chat, we've sent a poll, a questionnaire for the participants. It's very important for us. It's important to get your feedback. The next webinar will be making adjustments. And for us, it's really important to hear you. So we don't have much time left, but if you have any questions or comments to our panelists, the floor is yours. So maybe I'll wait a couple of minutes to see if any of you would like to ask questions. Well, just wanted to come back to a point. I'm not a Quebecer, I'm Caledonian and Canadian. So I was interested in knowing for health where we are at. And for the association, Présence Canal, that I represent, we will have the chance to see the work that you're doing and maybe to find some inspiration for us for our work in New Caledonia. So I think it was very, very interesting and moving. because it's a struggle. It's an everyday struggle, even for us. Reconciliation for us, for the Kanaki from New Caledonia, reconciliation is still a dream to us. And I realize that there's still a long way, even here, a long way to go. And I see that there are many things in common because we're discovering the history of Canada through the Indigenous history told by Indigenous people. And what we're trying to do with our association in New Caledonia to give a voice to the Kanaks so that they can tell their own story. But it's still very challenging, very difficult for us. But I see so many things in common, and we have much to learn from you. So thank you for that sharing. Thank you for your honesty as well. And we have only one or two researchers very well known in New Caledonia, but not really acknowledged by the French. It's Dr. Edi Wadrawan and Subama Mapu. So one is anthropologist and the other one is the biologist, but they're almost invisible. They're very little acknowledged. So when I get back, I'll tell them all that I've heard, because it will do them good to know that we can open up those discussions and we can reach out to a broader public, broader audience. Thank you. Thank you so much, Claudia. And it's really touching to see that we have international Indigenous persons who also join our webinar. So I'm sure that we will carry on with that discussion. We'll continue that discussion in the future if you're still interested, of course. And we really need that. We need that exchange, especially because this year we would like to organize some webinars with researchers, Kanak researchers, because in New Caledonia, they're not really visible. However, we have quite a beautiful Kanak literature. So we have a whole job to do this year to give some visibility to those authors. So if they don't want to give us visibility home, then we try to get visibility elsewhere, abroad. So I'll share my contact. Thank you. Yes? Did you want to add anything? Oh, it was just to say goodbye. Elena? Oh, Stéphane.
Speakers have changed their minds about it. I can, because I like I said.
Mais je pense que Stéphane voulait peut-être dire quelque chose.
Oui, vas-y.
I just wanted to say, Janine, if you need an external evaluation on one of your committee members, please submit my name. Because sometimes, depending on the promotion, whatever, so, you need external kind of people having a look. So I think, I think that's one way that we can help each other out. Not because, I'll be friendlier with you necessarily, but because I think that we can reframe your work differently than someone who might less understand it, right? And I think that's one of the c'est des atouts du network, where you get to know other people, and then and I think all that to say that I think you can find a lot of partners and kind of like value people that will clearly define the value of the things that you need to show value for at the institution level. So yeah.
Donc, si on n'a pas d'autres questions, on va terminer le webinaire aujourd'hui. Merci énormément.
So if you don't have any other questions, we'll end our webinar.
It was a great pleasure to see everyone. C'était un plaisir de vous voir. Puis on se revoit.
So next webinar will be in February. And I'll give you the date. So the next webinar will be on the joint committees and the Indigenous Committee and positions dedicated to reconciliation.
Fully Indigenous, or I'm not sure what the word is in English, but are committees that are dedicated to decolonization, reconciliation, and indigenization, and jobs that are not jobs, but there's probably a better word to say this, but they post jobs that are dedicated to these functions within post-secondary education. Merci énormément. Thank you, everyone.
Merci, thank you. And I've put the feedback form in the chat again. So.
Merci à tous.
Right?
Merci Stéphane, et merci Janine, merci Trina. Trina est déjà partie.
Janine, are you still there?
Et
Yeah,
merci
so-
aux traducteurs
Yeah.
également.
Yeah,
Thank you all. Thank you to our panelists and the translators. Thank you.